The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the young boy standing before the judge. He was barely 15, dressed in a simple gray hoodie, his hands tucked into his pockets as he stared down at the floor. He didn't fidget, didn't speak out, just stood there quietly, waiting. The judge, an older man with silver hair and glasses, adjusted his robe and glanced at the papers in front of him. He let out a sigh, shaking his head before looking up at the boy. Well, well, another case of a young man making bad choices, the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What do we have here? Some kind of troublemaker who doesn't even care to defend himself. A few people in the courtroom chuckled softly, but most sat silently, unsure of what was about to unfold. The boy's mother sat in the front row, clutching her purse tightly, her eyes pleading with him to say something, to defend himself. But he remained quiet. It was as if he didn't care. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-looking man in a navy suit, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Your Honor, this young man has refused to speak during questioning. He doesn't have much to say for himself. Seems to think he's above the law. The judge smirked. Oh, so now you're too good to talk? Or is it that you just don't have anything intelligent to say? He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head again. This is what happens when kids don't take responsibility for their actions. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Some seemed uncomfortable, others amused. But the boy didn't flinch. He simply looked up, meeting the judge's gaze for the first time. His eyes were steady, unreadable. The judge raised an eyebrow, waiting for some kind of reaction, but there was none. The boy's defense attorney, a woman in her mid-30s with a determined look on her face, finally spoke up. Your Honor, I believe there is a misunderstanding here. My client has not spoken because he chooses not to, not because he cannot. The judge scoffed. Oh, so now he's taking some kind of vow of silence. What, is he some kind of genius who thinks he's better than the rest of us? His tone was mocking, but he had no idea just how ironic his words were. The boy's mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. Your Honor, please, if you just let him. But the judge waved his hand dismissively. No need. I've seen cases like this 100 times. Kids with no respect, no future. He turned back to the boy. So tell me, are you going to finally say something? Or do I have to assume you just don't have anything worth saying? For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. The tension in the air was thick. Then slowly, the boy took a step forward. He looked at the judge directly, his expression calm. And then, when he finally opened his mouth to speak, what he said left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. The judge's smirk faded instantly. His expression shifted from amusement to shock, then something even deeper, something close to embarrassment. The prosecutor, who had been standing confidently, suddenly looked uncertain. Murmurs filled the room as people leaned forward in their seats, whispering to each other, trying to process what they had just heard. Even the boy's mother looked surprised, tears forming in her eyes. The defense attorney, however, simply smiled. She had known all along. She had been waiting for this moment, for the truth to finally come out. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He looked back down at the papers on his desk as if trying to make sense of them, but the weight of the moment was clear on his face. For the first time in a long time, he found himself at a loss for words. What had just been revealed changed everything. And no one in that courtroom would ever see the quiet boy in the gray hoodie the same way again. The courtroom remained silent, everyone still reeling from what the boy had just said. The judge, who had been so quick to assume the worst, found himself staring, unsure of how to respond. The boy's voice had been steady, his words clear, and there was an unmistakable confidence behind them. It was not the voice of someone lost or confused. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the judge before clearing his throat. Your Honor, I believe we should take a moment to review the facts before we proceed any further. His tone had changed, no longer carrying the same arrogance it had earlier. The judge hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, that would be wise. He reached for the file in front of him, flipping through the pages as if seeing them for the first time. His eyes moved over the information, his expression hard to read. The boy remained standing, his posture relaxed but not careless. His mother, still clutching her purse, watched him closely, her face a mixture of worry and pride. She had always known her son was different, brilliant even, but she had never imagined he would have to prove himself like this, in a courtroom where people had already decided who he was before he had a chance to speak. The defense attorney took a small step forward, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, I believe the real issue here is not what my client has done, but rather the assumptions that have been made about him. He is not some delinquent standing before you today. In fact, he is quite the opposite. The judge frowned, his grip tightening on the papers. And what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, the attorney continued, that this courtroom has misjudged him entirely. That instead of listening, you all chose to assume. And now the truth is beginning to unravel. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Journalists who had been taking notes now leaned forward with renewed interest. The spectators who had simply come to witness another routine case were starting to realize this was anything but ordinary. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, who remained silent. He then turned his attention back to the boy. Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us. Who exactly are you, and why do you think you're standing here today? The boy met his gaze without hesitation. I'm here because people assume things about me before they even know me, he said plainly. Because when they see a quiet kid in a hoodie, they think trouble. They don't think about what else could be true. The judge narrowed his eyes. And what exactly is true? The boy didn't break eye contact. I'm one of the youngest accepted members of a highly prestigious academic program, he said, his voice even. I've been solving equations meant for college students since I was 10. I've worked on research projects with professionals twice my age. But none of that mattered the moment I walked into this courtroom. You didn't see any of that. You saw what you wanted to see. A heavy silence fell over the room. Some people looked skeptical, others stunned. The judge's fingers tapped against the desk, his expression unreadable. His mother finally spoke, her voice filled with emotion. I've watched my son work harder than anyone I've ever known. He doesn't talk much, but that's because he's always thinking, always learning. And yet, here he is, being treated like a lost cause before anyone even asks who he really is. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. He had handled countless cases in his years on the bench, but this was different. Something about it made him uncomfortable, made him question his own instincts. Had he really been so quick to judge? The defense attorney continued, her tone unwavering. Your Honor, if you take a moment to review his academic records, his test scores, his work, you will see that this boy is not a criminal. He is a prodigy, and he deserves to be recognized for who he truly is, not for who people assume he must be. The judge hesitated, then turned to his clerk. Bring me everything we have on this case. Now, as the clerk scrambled to gather the documents, the tension in the room only grew. No one had expected this turn of events. What had started as a simple hearing was now something much bigger. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a stage where truth was finally being forced into the light. The boy stood there, unmoving, unshaken. He had waited for this moment. And now, as the judge flipped through the new documents in front of him, realization dawning on his face, it was clear that everything was about to change. The judge's eyes scanned the documents in front of him, his expression shifting from skepticism to something else, something that almost resembled regret. He cleared his throat, but the weight in the room made even that small gesture feel significant. The boy stood still, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. His mother clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles turning white. The silence dragged on, thick with expectation. The prosecutor, who had initially been so confident, now looked uneasy. He leaned toward the judge and whispered something, but the judge didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to the defense attorney. "These records," he said, lifting one of the papers slightly. "They say this young man has an IQ in the genius range, that he's been involved in academic research far beyond his age level, that he's been recognized by institutions I've actually heard of." His voice held a strange mix of disbelief and something else, something that hinted at an internal struggle he wasn't ready to admit to. The defense attorney nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Everything you're reading is correct. And yet, none of it was considered before he was brought here today." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people shifted in their seats, suddenly unsure about the assumptions they had walked in with. The boy remained quiet, his expression calm but sharp. He had known this moment would come. He had seen it play out before, people underestimating him, only to be shocked when they realized the truth. But this was different. This was happening in a courtroom, where people's words had real consequences, where a decision made in ignorance could change the course of someone's life. The judge sighed, rubbing his forehead. He looked at the prosecutor. Why wasn't any of this presented before? His tone had lost its earlier edge, but there was still a demand for accountability in his voice. The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, the focus of this case was not." The judge cut him off. "The focus of this case was based on an assumption, wasn't it?" He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the audience, the jury, the press. "We looked at this boy and decided who he was before we ever let him speak. And now we're realizing we may have been wrong." The boy's mother took a small step forward, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't the first time," she said. "It won't be the last." Her words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of a system that had failed them before and would likely fail them again. The defense attorney pressed on. "Your Honor, my client is not here today because of anything he did wrong. He's here because someone saw him in the wrong place at the wrong time and assumed the worst. And that assumption has led us all to this moment, where a boy who should be preparing for his future is instead having to defend his very existence." The tension in the room deepened. The judge looked back at the boy, really looking this time, as if trying to see beyond what he thought he knew. The boy met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unwavering. He wasn't afraid. He had never been afraid. But he was tired of having to prove himself over and over again, just to be seen as worthy of the opportunities others were handed without question. A journalist in the back scribbled notes furiously, realizing that this case was no longer just another routine trial. It was becoming a story, one that would force people to confront their own biases, one that would make headlines and start conversations that had been ignored for too long. The judge shifted in his seat, his thoughts clearly racing. He had built his career on being fair, on making decisions based on facts rather than emotions. And yet, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth settling in his chest. This boy had never been given a fair chance. The prosecutor looked down, suddenly very interested in his notes. The defense attorney remained steady, waiting. The mother stood firm, holding on to the years of struggle that had led them to this moment. And the boy, the quiet genius who had been treated like a criminal, simply stood there, waiting for the world to finally catch up to the truth. The courtroom felt heavier now, as if the very walls were pressing in with the weight of what was happening. The judge tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind visibly wrestling with something unspoken. He had seen many cases before, passed countless judgments, but this one was different. It wasn't just about the facts on paper. It was about the assumptions that had led them here in the first place. He exhaled sharply and leaned forward. The boy stood motionless, his dark eyes locked onto the judge, calm but unwavering. He wasn't intimidated. He had spent his life in rooms where people had already decided who he was before he had even opened his mouth. But today, something was shifting. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, whispers of doubt creeping into the minds of those who had once been so sure of his guilt. The prosecutor cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, avoiding the judge's stare. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quieter than before, "while the defendant may be highly intelligent, we must not let that distract us from the charges brought against him." He shot a quick glance toward the audience, as if searching for approval, but the energy in the room had changed. The usual confidence he carried was starting to waver. The defense attorney wasted no time. "Let's talk about those charges," she said smoothly, stepping forward. "Let's talk about how they were built on nothing but an assumption." She turned, addressing the entire courtroom. This young man was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was enough for him to be labeled as a suspect. No evidence, no real investigation. Just a quiet black teenager standing near a crime scene. A few people in the jury exchanged glances, their faces uncertain. The boy's mother clutched her purse tighter, her breath slow and controlled, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury. She had been here before, watching her son be dismissed, overlooked and misunderstood. But this time, people were starting to listen. The judge drummed his fingers on the desk again. "Let's go over the witness statements one more time," he said, his voice steady, but laced with something deeper, something that hinted at regret. He motioned for the court clerk to bring forward the documents. "I want to hear exactly what was said about this young man before anyone knew his background." The room grew eerily silent as the papers were shuffled, the sound of each page turning filling the space. The prosecution's case had been built on nothing more than the testimony of a single witness who had claimed to see a suspicious young man near the scene. No real details, no actual proof, just an assumption. The defense attorney took a slow step toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call that witness to the stand once again." She turned to the back of the courtroom, where a middle-aged man with shifting eyes sat nervously. He had been confident before, sure of his words, but now, with the truth unraveling in front of him, his certainty was beginning to crack. The man hesitated before standing, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He had given his testimony days earlier, believing it to be the final word. But now, standing under the scrutiny of a judge who was no longer playing along, he looked uncomfortable. The judge's gaze remained sharp. "You testified that you saw the defendant acting suspiciously. Can you clarify exactly what you saw?" The man licked his lips, his confidence faltering. I saw him near the store. He was just standing there." The defense attorney raised an eyebrow. "Standing there. That's it." The man shifted in his seat. "Well, yeah, I mean, it was late. And he looked like he didn't belong there." A heavy silence followed. The words hung in the air, echoing louder than any accusation. He didn't belong there. That was the foundation of the entire case. That was why the boy had been dragged into this courtroom in the first place. Not because of something he had done, but because of how someone else had perceived him. The judge inhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. The prosecutor was silent now, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The audience had stopped whispering, the weight of the moment settling over them like a thick fog. The boy stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. He had nothing left to prove. The truth was already in the open. Now it was just a matter of whether the people in this room were willing to see it. The judge exhaled, his fingers laced together as he studied the nervous witness in front of him. The courtroom felt different now, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone inside. The young boy had remained calm through it all, but something in his eyes hinted that he was waiting for something no one else saw coming. Just as the judge was about to speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A tall man in a dark suit strode in, his presence commanding instant attention. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he approached the defense table. The boy turned slightly, recognition flickering in his expression, but he remained silent. The defense attorney glanced at the man, surprised. "Can we help you?" Without hesitation, the man pulled out a badge from inside his suit jacket and held it up. "Agent Markham, FBI." The entire courtroom stiffened. The judge's eyebrows shot up in confusion. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. The witness in the chair seemed to shrink, his fingers gripping the edges of his seat. The FBI. What did they have to do with this case? Markham turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent information that changes everything about this trial." His voice was sharp, professional, leaving no room for argument. The judge hesitated, glancing between the defense and prosecution before nodding. "Proceed." The agent turned his attention to the boy, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, this young man isn't just an innocent bystander. He's part of an ongoing federal investigation, one that your court was never informed of." The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Even the most stoic members of the jury leaned forward, tension crackling through the air. The prosecutor looked blindsided, flipping through his files as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. The defense attorney crossed her arms. "That's quite a claim, Agent. Care to explain what exactly he's being investigated for?" Markham didn't flinch. "Not investigated. Protected." A stunned silence followed. Even the judge seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The boy stood still, his posture straight, but his eyes flickered with something close to resignation, like he had expected this moment all along. The agent continued, stepping closer to the judge's bench. "This young man is not only innocent, he is the key witness in a case much bigger than what's being discussed here today. And if this court had convicted him, you would have been handing over one of our most valuable assets to the very people we are trying to stop." Murmurs erupted through the courtroom. The boy's mother clutched her chest, her breath shaky as she processed what was being said. The defense attorney, usually composed, pressed her lips together in thought. The judge rapped his gavel twice, calling for order. The prosecutor was the first to break the silence. This is absurd. If this were true, why weren't we informed sooner?" Agent Markham turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Because we didn't anticipate this case would reach trial. But clearly, someone wanted this young man silenced before he could testify in another case. They saw an opportunity to frame him, and your office nearly played right into their hands." The witness in the chair suddenly looked more uncomfortable than ever. Sweat formed on his brow, and his leg bounced anxiously. The defense attorney noticed. She took a slow step toward him. "You were part of it, weren't you?" Her voice was quieter now, but it cut through the noise. "You weren't just some passerby who saw something suspicious. You were planted." All eyes turned to the man in the witness chair. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking. I don't know what you're talking about." But his voice betrayed him. Agent Markham let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "We do." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the judge's bench. "This witness, James Horner, has known affiliations with a criminal network under federal investigation. We believe his testimony was deliberately fabricated to put this young man behind bars before he could testify in our case." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The boy's mother pressed her hand over her mouth, disbelief in her eyes. The judge looked through the documents in front of him, his expression darkening with every passing second. The entire case had been a setup. The prosecutor, suddenly looking pale, fumbled for words. "Your Honor, I need time to review this." The judge's voice was firm. "You've had plenty of time, counselor." And now it looks like justice was about to be delivered to the wrong person. The boy, standing at the center of it all, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but carried through the entire room. "I told you I didn't do it." His words landed like a hammer, and now no one in the courtroom could deny the truth. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The weight of the truth hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. The young boy, who had been dismissed, mocked, and nearly sentenced for a crime he didn't commit, stood with quiet strength. The judge, who had earlier regarded him with skepticism, now looked at him with something else: regret. Agent Markham turned to the judge. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request that all charges against this young man be dropped immediately. He is not only innocent, but his safety is now at risk." The judge looked down at the folder containing proof of the setup, his fingers drumming against the wooden bench. He let out a long breath, then straightened his posture. "The court finds the defendant not guilty. All charges are dismissed." His voice rang through the room, final and absolute. The boy's mother gasped, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her son's hand. The defense attorney exhaled in relief, but there was still a sense of unease lingering in the room. The prosecutor, who had aggressively pursued the case, looked humiliated but said nothing. The so-called witness, James Horner, sat frozen, his face pale. Horner swallowed hard, glancing toward the prosecutor, then toward the door as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. Markham took a step closer. "We already know the answer," he said. "You were paid off, weren't you? You were never here to tell the truth. You were here to bury it." The tension in the room reached its peak. Everyone waited for Horner to deny it, to lash out, to fight back, but instead, he slumped in his chair. His hands clenched into fists before he let out a shaky breath. "I had no choice," he muttered. But before anyone could move, the boy, who had remained composed through it all, turned to face Horner directly. "You tried to destroy my life," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why?" Agent Markham nodded, as if he had been expecting that response. "That's where you're wrong. You had a choice, and you made the wrong one." The judge wasted no time. "Bailiff, take Mr. Horner into custody. He will be charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." The bailiff moved swiftly, grabbing Horner's arm. He didn't resist. He just slipped down, knowing there was nothing left to say. As Horner was escorted out, the judge finally turned his full attention to the boy. "Young man," he said, his voice softer now, "I misjudged you. And for that, I apologize. You are more than what people assume." The boy didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. "I just want the truth to matter." The judge gave a small nod of respect. "So do I." But just as the tension seemed to settle, Agent Markham's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted. Without a word, he walked over to the defense attorney and whispered something in her ear. Her eyes widened in shock. "What is it?" the boy's mother asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. Markham hesitated, then looked at the young boy. It's not over. The courtroom, which had just begun to breathe, froze once more. The case was solved, or so they thought. But whatever Markham had just learned would change everything. The room fell silent again as everyone's eyes turned to Agent Markham. The young boy, still standing tall despite everything, clenched his fists slightly, bracing for what was next. His mother took a step closer, instinctively protective. But Markham's expression wasn't one of fear. It was one of urgency. "We just got word that the people behind this setup aren't done," Markham said. His voice was low but firm. "This wasn't just about getting you arrested. They wanted to send a message." The boy exchanged a glance with his mother. "Who are they?" he asked. Markham hesitated for a moment before answering. "A powerful group. Corrupt officials, businessmen, people with influence. They weren't counting on you being smart enough to expose them." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "But now that you have, they might try to silence you." The boy's mother gripped his hand tightly, her fear obvious. "What does that mean? Is my son in danger?" Markham met her gaze, then looked at the judge, who seemed equally concerned. "We need to move quickly," he said. "We have enough evidence to go after the people responsible, but we need to ensure your son stays safe." The judge, who had spent much of the trial underestimating the boy, now looked at him differently. "I'll sign whatever orders are necessary to protect him," he said. But he hesitated before speaking again. "Young man, what do you want to do? You've already been through so much." For the first time since the trial began, the boy allowed himself a small smile. "I want to finish what I started," he said. "If people like that can ruin lives and get away with it, someone has to stand up to them." His mother looked at him with worry, but also with pride. The judge gave a small nod of approval. "Then let's make sure the truth wins." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With Agent Markham's help, the evidence against the corrupt officials was presented to federal investigators. The case gained national attention, and the once quiet teenager found himself at the center of a major scandal. The same people who had tried to silence him were now scrambling to save themselves. One by one, arrests were made. Some of the most powerful figures involved were exposed, and the conspiracy unraveled. The boy's courage had set off a chain reaction, proving that the truth, no matter how buried, could always find its way to the surface. Through it all, he remained focused. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He just wanted justice. And when reporters asked him how he had stayed so strong, his answer was simple. "I knew I wasn't alone," he said. "The truth is bigger than any one person." In the end, the judge who had once doubted him was one of the first to publicly commend him. "I misjudged you," he admitted in a press statement. "And I learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate someone just because they're quiet. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truth." With the case closed and justice served, life slowly returned to normal. But the boy was forever changed. He had seen the power of standing up for what's right, and he knew his journey was just beginning. He didn't just want to prove people wrong. He wanted to help others who were unheard, just like he once was. As he and his mother walked out of the courthouse for the last time, she looked at him with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You okay?" she asked softly. He smiled at her, the weight of everything finally lifting. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am."